It's loading. You get a little message on your screen in case you haven't done
Hmm.
this before. Yeah.
No, I have not.
Yeah, the first time I did it, I was really terrified. Now I'm just like, yeah, the bar, it's going. It's taking a lot. Like
We do it all the time now. It's
we
part
do
of the
this so
process.
much. It's like we're so desensitized after the pandemic. We're just like, whatever. Um, okay. Yeah, it's just a little slow, but it's cool.
Thanks for your patience.
Nate, we have some people in the waiting room. Can you let them in, please?
Yes, I am. I'm letting them along the way. Are we ready, Ricardo?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone to our Historians of Catholic Mexico, HisCat Mex book talk, where we feature the author, Dr. Rebecca Janzen, and she'll talk about her book, Unholy Trinity. And it's really excited for her presentation today. And then we're also pleased to have the comments by Dr. Jaime Bensado and Dr. David Dalton. And I'll be introducing the three of them in a second. But before I do so, I just want to introduce myself. So I'm Dr. Nathan Elstrand. I am a postdoc at San Diego State University. And I'd like to take the moment to introduce the co-coordinator of HisCat Next as well. Ricardo, do you want to give a quick introduction?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Nathan and I are very excited to kick off our fourth year of programming, and you'll be receiving a calendar from us very soon, as early as next week. We do have some workshops lined up for the semester, as well as a couple other book talks and an archive presentation happening in the spring. So thank you all for joining, and stay tuned. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. Y yo quiero decir algo en español también, pues hola a todos, todas, todes, bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenides a esta presentación del libro de Unholy Trinity. Soy Nathan Elstrand y mi colega es Ricardo Alvarez Pimentel y vamos a empezar con las introducciones. So I'm gonna, pues la mayoría de la presentación y va a estar en español, pero si quieres preguntar en español, no, la mayoría de la presentación va a ser en inglés, pero si quieres preguntar en español, está bien, perdón. So we're going to start off with the introductions. And first, we're going to start off with Rebecca's introduction. So Dr. Rebecca Janzen is McCausland Fellow and Professor of Spanish and Comparative Literature at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. She has written 4 books about literature, film, religion, and law in Mexico. The National Body in Mexican Literature, Collective Challenges to Biopolitical Control, 2015. Liminal Sovereignty, Mennonites and Mormons in Mexican Culture, 2018. Unholy Trinity, State, Church, and Film in Mexico, 2021, the book we'll be talking about today. And Unlawful Violence, Law and Cultural Production in 21st Century Mexico, 2022. Of the 2 commentators we have today, one is Dr. Jaime M. Bensado. He is an associate professor of history and director of the Mexican Work Group at the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in contemporary Mexican history, student movements, youth culture, the global 60s, and the Cold War. He co-edited Mexico Beyond 1968, Revolutionaries, Radicals, and Repression during the global 60s and subversive 70s. And that's from 2018 with Enrique C. Ochoa, and is the author of Rebel Mexico, Student Unrest and Authoritarian Political Culture During the Long 60s from 2013. And Love and Despair, his most recent book, How Catholic Activism Shaped Politics and the Counterculture in Modern Mexico from 2023. And last but not least, our second commentator today is Dr. David S. Dalton. He is an associate professor of Spanish and director of Latin American Studies at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. His research theorizes the interface of science, technology, and the body, and how this contributes to racial and gender hierarchies in Mexico and throughout Latin America. He is the author of Robos Sacer, Necroliberalism and Cyborg Resistance in Mexican and Chicanx Dystopias in 2023, and Mestizo Modernity, Race, Technology, and the Body in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, 2018. He has also edited several books and special editions in journals. These include Animation in Mexico, 2006 to 2022, Box Office, Web Shorts, and Streaming, that's forthcoming from SUNY Press, Anti-Catholicism in the Mexican Revolution, 1913-1940, 2024, Imagining Latinidad, Digital Diasporas and Public Engagement Among Latin American Migrants, 2023, and Healthcare in Latin America, History, Society, Culture, 2022. He has written some 30 articles and book chapters on different aspects of Mexican and Latin American studies. Now we're going to go towards our main event. The main presenter today, Dr. Janzen, will have about 15 to 20 minutes for her presentation. This will be followed by comments by Dr. Pensado and Dr. Dalton of about 10 to 15 minutes each. Dr. Rebecca Janzen, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm just gonna put on my timer so I, more or less abide by the time. So I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Y como dijo el doctor Elstrand, yo podría conversar con ustedes en español o inglés después, pero como escribí el libro en inglés, se me hace mucho más fácil dar la charla en inglés. So I will be speaking in English, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my book that came out in 2021, and my face has suddenly gone extremely bright when I started screen sharing. All right, I think this will be okay. So good evening. I'm going to be talking about the films in general that I look at in this book, some of the framework I develop, and then I'm going to do a case study of one of the films so that you can get a little bit of an idea of the approach that I use. I'm going to mention, but not dwell on, some fairly disturbing elements of the film about religious abuse, child sexual abuse, miscarriage, and suicide. So I just wanted to let you all know that before we got started. So the movies that I analyze in this book all touch on religion, using religious symbols, rhetoric, tropes in some way. I argue that religious symbols are one of the ways that a series of 9 films can be understood as a critique of several aspects of Mexican culture and society, particularly confining gender roles for men and women, the way that the Mexican government oppressed Mexican people, and the ways that the government policies are often ineffective at meeting people's needs. The majority of the religious symbols and imagery in these films come from the Catholic Church, which of course relates to the historians of Catholic Mexico, and because Mexico is a predominantly Catholic country where, regardless of people's cognitive assent to a series of Catholic beliefs, this is a series of symbols, ideas, rhetoric that will resonate with audiences. Some films use other types of imagery, like this one, Ángel de Fuego, is by director Dana Rothberg, and it combines some aspects of Catholicism with new Pentecostal types of religious movements, as well as her own tradition, which is Jewish, and some indigenous Mexican traditions. I also truthfully look at religious symbols and imagery in these films because I think it's really interesting, and because I think religion conveys something important about the human experience. And it can lead people to extremes in both good and bad directions, although of course we always hope that it is leading people to good directions. I'm sorry, my face is too blindingly white. And I'm a very pale person. This YouTube is gonna be looking really weird if you are seeing this after. Sorry, folks. Okay, this is better. Excellent. So the book analyzes 9 films, and I can tell you what they are on the next slide. So they're divided into 3 chapters. The first chapter looks at the golden age of Mexican film, from, you could say, 1933 to 1964. Those are the years I picked. You could pick other years, other scholars have. These are really popular films in Mexico that they just have an incredible number of views on YouTube, which only represents a fraction of the amount of people who've watched them. That would be Maria Candelaria and Rio Escondido. And Seminarista does not have nearly so many. And these are some of the screenshots of images that I analyze in the film, or the film poster. So this is one of the characters in Maria Candelaria at an altar to the Virgen de Guadalupe. And this is a teacher in the film Rio Escondido, and a scene that I analyze where you can see her at the front of this group of children. She's being sent to give revolutionary teaching knowledge, of course, that is secular and against Catholic traditions. But if you look at how it's set up, it echoes so much the structure of a Catholic church. There's a little baby in one of the corners who's on a crib, like hanging, that looks kind of like, particularly in the lighting in the film, the way that the host is hung from the ceiling of a church in a special basket, which would represent Jesus. And this is a child potentially representing the future. It's one of my most favorite scenes to look at in this film. The third film that I look at in this time period is El Seminarista, which is about a seminarian who's sent to teach at a girls' school. And of course, they all fall in love with him. And one of them draws this picture of him. These films all have incredibly famous Mexican actors in them, and are really only a small fraction of these actors and directors' incredible oeuvre or obra. The second chapter of this book looks at films from the 1960s and 70s. We have films that are what I would call B movies, El Oficio Más Antiguo del Mundo, and Las Chicas Malas del Padre Méndez, and then Canoa, which is much more famous internationally. This is a still from Las Chicas Malas del Padre Méndez, where the priest in question is trying to reform a bunch of sex workers. And then El Oficio Más Antiguo del Mundo is also about sex work, but the priest has different intentions. I think they're both quite funny, and again, have really popular actors, and are part of a subgenre of B movies in the 1970s that feature priests in prostíbulos. Apparently there are many, not apparently, there are many more of this kind of film. The third film is Canoa, Memoria de un hecho vergonzoso, which is about a priest that engineers a massacre against people who are purportedly communist. And then the third grouping of films are somewhat more recent, from the 1990s and 2000s, El Crimen del Padre Amaro, Novia que te vea, and Ángel de Fuego. Novia que te vea is about Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jewish communities in Mexico City. This is a still image from a youth gathering. And Ángel de Fuego, I will talk about a little bit more shortly. And El Crimen del Padre Amaro, the version that I have on my computer in ways that remain completely unknown, has obligatory subtitles in English. But this is a scene, this is a priest who abuses a young parishioner who becomes pregnant, and they have a encounter in the confession booth. And so this is where you can see the grate of the confession booth in front of his face. And this young, promising priest is contrasted with other priests in the film. And in all of these cases, I relate powerful figures to broader powerful structures, or things that are happening in the Mexican context, or significant religious imagery and interaction with that imagery, like the altar to the Virgen de Guadalupe, and think about how that functions within the film, and also how that functions with the audience. And so I will speak a little bit about one of these films, Ángel de Fuego, as a case study of what I'm doing in this book. So in the case of this film, I look at the specific religious practice, the religious leader, and the religious space. I think that I will not talk about all three of those in the interest of time, and in the interest of my less than amazing internet connection. I have some clips, but I think that I will speed through those and just have a still image, because that will work a little bit better. So what happens in this film? The religion is a unique interpretation of Christianity, unlike any varieties I'm familiar with. The religious leader is a woman called refugio, or a refuge, and the religious space is the back of a truck where a puppet show is set up to give Christian religious instruction. It portrays a young girl, Alma, played by the actor Evangelina Sosa, who's a trapeze artist in a circus. Her father abuses her and she becomes pregnant. And after he dies, a pregnant Alma leaves the circus to join the Misioneros de la Nueva Alianza, a traveling group of puppeteers who put on religious performances in neighborhoods where people have less economic resources. This group is led by the character Refugio, who's accompanied by her son Sacramento and another boy, Noe. The puppet show travels around, and at one stop, Refugio convinces Alma to engage in a purification ritual, which causes Alma to have a miscarriage. After these experiences, Alma returns to the circus, then back to the Misionero, returns to the circus, and in her final performance, burns the circus tent to the ground. The film was released in 1992, and while the events are fictional, I think that it alludes pretty strongly to Mexico in that time period, offering incisive social commentary. So in 1990 in Mexico, or 1992, Mexico had been in a period of significant economic instability, resulting from the 1982 oil crisis. And in this film, religious symbols underline the devastation that this had, particularly on the most marginalized people. The film introduces religion fairly early on. After Alma leaves the circus, she wanders through the city performing on the street, like at stoplights and things like that. And all of a sudden, she hears a voice that says, Dios prometió a su pueblo. And Alma walks toward this voice and arrives at what we can see here. So this is on the back of a very large truck that it's turned into a stage. Alma walks and the voice continues to speak, and the camera cuts from Alma to show marionettes on stage, which we can see here. And I think they look a little bit like alebrijes. This is the first time that we encounter the religion on screen, and in this initial snippet, we hear a combined obsession with the end times, Mexican culture with the alebrijes, so the end times being connected to Pentecostalism, and perhaps medieval Catholic tradition of morality plays for audiences who communicate primarily through speaking rather than through writing. And this is the religious leader who sits at the left-hand side of the stage, occupying almost half the space on screen. And you can see a little bit of the smoke that is being used to give her kind of more mysterious or sacred appearance. The camera stays fixed on her, showing her eyes are half closed, and she appears in a trance. She says that there's room for everyone in God's kingdom. And Alma walks onto the screen towards Refugio, who touches Alma's cheek. And then she disappears into a cloud of smoke, and the curtain closes where the edge of the truck would be. So I think that Refugio's clothing calls to mind Catholic leaders who wear purple once they reach a certain level of status. The bishops wear robes that are magenta most of the year, and all Catholic clergy would wear purple during Lent and Advent. Purple is also the color of penitence, which aligns with Refugio's main message about people's need to change. So there's a show of leadership, a call to religious change, and clear ties to Pentecostalism and Catholicism, and special effects from the 1990s. This is a great movie, and it's really fun to watch a little bit older movies and just see the technology evolve, even though that's not part of my analysis. And in all of this, we can see that Refugio really knows how to give a good performance. She also creates a space for her community in this truck bed situation. And when she starts new rituals, she has a sanctification ritual. When she starts like a new puppet setup, evangelization situation, she always does a ritual. Here, in this scene, the camera moves almost as slowly as the characters do. And you can see the mountains in the background and buildings that suggest perhaps the outskirts of a city where people have to commute pretty far to work would be living. And what Sacramento is doing is like sowing seeds, perhaps indicating that she is separating the space, making it holy, perhaps trying to imbue this fairly sandy, desert-like environment with grain, so a symbol of fertility. The ground in the film never grows anything, even though this could at one time have been like farmland for small landholders or for communities in an ejido. But now the sandy soil is at the edge of an urban area, and it's not growing anything. This could allude to rural outmigration in the time period, to the failure of rural and urban development programs, or perhaps foreshadow Refugio's own religious failures. So Ángel de Fuego presents this religion that combines elements of established traditions in a new way. Many of the images in the film would have been very familiar or easily identifiable for viewers. And the leader is very good at performing, and she's malevolent. She sanctifies the space that really leads to nothing, and except for the end times. The puppet show is full of smoke and mirrors. No one produces anything of lasting value, and the only escape from the world on screen is by death. This imagery, which I consider allegorical for its context of production, implies that leaders are performative, that they might be puppets of other powers, such as the United States, that their policies are fruitless, especially for people who need them the most. I often think about these final comments that I'm making whenever I talk about this film, about economic policies only benefiting a few people. In this case, it's about Mexico in 1992. But we could think about where I live in the United States of America in 2024. And I'm left wondering what to do with that and what art and film can do for us today. Can it instruct us? Can it provide us with hope? Is it an escape? With those thoughts in mind, I would like to show you the final image of the film. Alma sets the circus on fire at the end of her last performance, and the remaining performers in her first home on screen watch their livelihood go up in flames. Sometimes, of course, I would also like to burn it all down, but only if it would give space for something new. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. That was a great overview of the book itself and the different aspects that you cover throughout your work. So I'm really excited to talk about it today. Our first commentator will be Dr. Jaime Pensado. Vamos a seguir con el doctor Jaime Pensado. Adelante.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First, I want to congratulate you again, Nathan and Ricardo, for your fourth year now with this space, which is amazing. And I think it brings so many people together. So a big, big, big congratulations to you guys. And thank you again for bringing me back. It's always nice to see you. And I also want to thank Rebecca for sharing her work. I found the book very, very engaging, fascinating, and I think it speaks to so many different disciplines, right? Not only to Romance languages, but of course to film studies and to historians like myself. So, my comments are gonna, of course, come from my discipline as a historian. So please cope with me. But it speaks very well to our community, right? In so many ways, because you do a tremendous job in kind of in explaining how the church remains relevant in Mexico, right? In the aftermath of the 1940s. I mean, if you look at modern Mexican history, right, the bulk of the literature, as we all know, it's written from, a secular perspective with an overwhelming emphasis on the Mexican Revolution, right? This post-revolutionary period. And the Catholic Church always seems to be sort of left to the side, right? In so many different ways. Of course, there's a new generation of historians who are sort of complicating that narrative. But I think what you do with the book you really demonstrate, right, how the church was never monolithic, right? That there's many different divisions within the church, but that it remained so relevant in the post-1940 period in so many different spaces, right? The films that you show really kind of articulate all the different spaces that religious figures occupied, right? Ranging from brothels to all kinds of the schools and all kinds of other places, right? So, I think we need to start paying more attention to this, and I think your book, in so many ways, really kind of provide us with a beautiful guidance on how to analyze these films, right? And how to use films as primary sources to tell our stories. And I really enjoy the fact that you really kind of giving us a sweeping overview of the 20th century, really, right? So it's really amazing to see the attention that you give to to religious symbolisms, to practices, right? To divergent understandings of popular and orthodox notions of Catholicism, which, as you show very well, they're always changing, right? And because you do that so well, you allow us to see how the church is thinking and making sense of questions related to political violence, crucial moments of political and economic crises, right? How they're engaged in kind of new rhetorics of anti-communism, and of course, shifting relationships between the church and state, which again are always changing. But also, what is always changing is these perceptions of gender, sexuality, the family, sacrifice. And I think the examples that you talk about demonstrate this very, very well, right? And of course, you can't leave out the Vatican II, and I think the films that you kind of use in reference to the 1970s kind of speak to how, or provide an explanation, rather, how the ideas of the Second Vatican Council were differently interpreted in Mexico, right? Mexico, to some extent, has a unique history, of course, because of its revolutions. So I think the films that you analyze kind of speak to that. But also, ultimately, I think the way in which you analyze these films provide us with a good understanding of the reasons why the PRI remained in power for so long, right? The longevity of the PRI had to do oftentimes with this kind of cozy relationship that the Catholic Church that it developed with the Catholic Church, right? And again, something that we know, but it's often left out in the historiography of post 1940 Mexico. And I think again, the examples that you provide us with really give us a good way to kind of talk about all of these issues that I mentioned and more, right? I mean, there's more stuff that you articulate so well in your book. So, in addition of being a historian, I also teach Mexican history and Latin American history through film. So I hope to use some of the chapters in your book, right, to kind of have my students kind of analyze with you some of these films. I particularly enjoy the analysis that you give us of El Río Escondido, which unfortunately is not, as far as I know, it doesn't have subtitles in English, which is really unfortunate. And the other film that I really enjoy, as you discuss in the book, is El Crimen del Padre Amaro. So again, I mean, I can talk about why I enjoy your analysis of these films if we have more time, but I really wanted to highlight how much I really enjoyed those two analyses. And of course, I also I grew up in Mexico City, and I understand the importance of films as tools that teach people, right, all kinds of things. And I think you also do that very well in explaining how filmmakers reference these sort of symbols to Catholicism and religiosity almost as pedagogical tools, right? Sort of to guide the audience about these complicated issues, ranging from political violence to child abuse and all kinds of things that these films talk about. So a big congratulations to you on this book. I think it's written in a way that the students would really enjoy, and I will certainly assign some of these chapters to my students, as I mentioned. So again, I do have some comments or some questions that are again mostly from the perspective of a historian. So please feel free to ignore what I raise. But I do. It did strike me to see a couple of things not present in the book, or maybe kind of alluded to, but I only wish that I know that we're so limited to the number of pages that we can have in a book, and we can only do so much. But there's a couple of things that I just wish, you're right, that could have been there. So one thing is like in the ideal world, I would love to see two more chapters, right? Like for instance, the 1950s and early 60s, right? I mean, you lump that together as part of the golden age of Mexican cinema, but I really have a hard time kind of thinking about the golden age until 1964. I see it more as a moment that really kind of comes to an end in the mid 50s at the most, right? All these kind of stars from Mexican cinema die. There's all kinds of strikes in the labor in the syndicates of the film industry. And there's just a crisis of nationalism, of the rhetoric of the Mexican Revolution, and a crisis of the cinematic language of the golden age of Mexican cinema that, of course, to some extent speaks or begins with, of course, the famous Luis Buñuel film Los Olvidados. But there's going to be so many other films in the 1950s and early 60s that kind of pick up on those critiques of that film to really kind of question the nationalistic tropes of the so-called golden age of Mexican cinema. So I wonder if the book would have benefited from another chapter that kind of speaks to again this 1950s, early mid 60s, before 64, right? 64 is a crucial moment, of course, because that's when you begin to have a more independent or a new generation of filmmakers kind of articulating a new Mexican cinema that would, of course, peak in the 1970s. But in the 50s and early 60s, I'm thinking of, questions related to urbanization, right? That bring new concepts of or anxieties related to modernization, the rise of youth as an actor in society, and of course new notions of gender and sexuality that you then pick up in the context of the 1970s. So I wish there had been kind of like an in-between of those two chapters, and also, if obviously it's impossible to add another chapter, but also the 1980s kind of I think deserves its own chapter in so many ways, before we actually get to kind of the neoliberal period, right? Of that sort of in between Echeverrismo and neoliberalism, the so-called lost decade of the 1980s, where there's a lot of kind of references to censorship, for instance, right, in the film industry. And I kept wondering how those issues related to censorship speak to notions of religiosity. Anyways, those are kind of like in my wish list. I wish there could have been a couple more chapters to kind of address these gaps. So that's one sort of a set of questions, I suppose. And again, take it or leave it. I understand why it's really hard to add a couple more chapters in that sense. I guess a related question or comment. I also kept wondering about like the producers of films, right? Again, post-revolutionary Mexico is a secular space, of course, one that has to kind of address the legacies of the revolution, right? All these things, right? And of course, the golden age of Mexican cinema speaks to that, right? But I think what's very interesting from my own research is that that Catholics also are directors, are film directors and producers, right? And I keep wondering, about how they are kind of taking advantage of this new relationship with the state to kind of push their Catholic narratives in these films, right? So, I was wondering if this can be discussed in a way that is a bit more assertive, like like where is this money coming from, right? And who are some of these Catholic figures who are beginning to kind of see film as a tool, right, of engagement with the state, but also with the Mexican people, right? Especially after the 1957 encyclical, right? Miranda Prorsus, that kind of speaks to the need for the Catholic Church to have a more kind of a fruitful dialogue with modernity in that sense. So I was wondering if there's an opportunity to kind of address how, again, this kind of Catholic institutions in general, but more specifically, film directors and producers are kind of elbowing their own way into this secular industry. So that's my second question. And the third one is just I always wonder about nuns and the representation of nuns in Mexican films. There's very little, right? I mean, it's overwhelmingly, Catholicism is overwhelmingly represented by priests. There are some films that do kind of speak to the role of nuns. But I wonder if, if you were to guess or if you were to include some of these films that kind of speak to the representation of nuns, what would be the story there? It'll be interesting to see how you would include a discussion of perhaps maybe a film or two that speak to that. And I have more stuff to say, but I just wanted to keep it short and give you three concrete things to maybe think about or to ignore, like I said before. But I want to say once again how much I really enjoy reading the book. It was a delight to read. So thank you for sharing it.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Pensado, for your comments. Definitely interesting to have your perspective as a historian in response to the book itself, kind of providing a different perspective. So thank you for that. Gracias por tus comentarios, Jaime. Y vamos a seguir con Dr. David Dalton. We're going to continue on with Dr. David Dalton and his comments as well.
All right, thank you for having me here. And Rebecca, thank you for writing the book. I had read it before, but I went back and reread it again because I wanted to make sure that I had my memory jogged. And so it was nice to go back and reread it. I went about this a little bit differently, but I wanted to, I wanted to kind of give you kind of a book review on steroids is kind of what I was thinking of with this. And so, but I am going to focus mostly on that first chapter because, of course, I've done quite a bit of work on Golden Age cinema and particularly two of the films that you talked about. And so I definitely, I like the whole thing, but that was, of course, kind of the part that I was most excited with. And so I'm just going to kind of jump from there. I'm going to turn on my stopwatch so that I don't go too long. Rebecca Janzen's Unholy Trinity explores the evolving relationship among the Mexican state, the Catholic Church, and society from the post-revolutionary period to the present. What is perhaps most interesting about the book is that she never asserts a direct tie between the projects of the church and those of the state, nor does she claim that either entity has hegemony in the realm of film production. Rather, she asserts a tension between ecclesiastical and state power that different filmmakers have explored through cinema as the relationship between the church and state has changed over the years. On the one hand, she certainly explores those cases where films have posited a degree of corruption among the clergy as they interface with the state, with both state and non-state actors for personal gain rather than for the good of their flock. On the other hand, however, she largely sidesteps the idea that the church could be subverting state power or that it may be meddling in national politics. For the most part, she views the church as a non-state actor that exists beyond the realm of political power, despite the fact that it constantly reinforces or challenges the ideals of the secular state. In that light, I will be discussing how two particularly important concepts that she explores play out throughout. The first of these is the distinction between popular Catholicism and institutional Catholicism. This is something that comes up over and over in the text. The second is often complementary role between the Catholic faith, popular, institutional, or both, and the state in decreeing the so-called proper articulations of gender performativity and morality and sexuality. So the book is divided into kind of three sections, and I really like the division for a lot of reasons. So first and foremost, we've got the Golden Age, we have what I call the Mexploitation Age, and then we have kind of the Neoliberal Age. And the dates, of course, the Golden Age, you chose 1933 to 64. A little different from the dates that I choose, but totally fine. I'm not gonna, I usually do 1936 to 1954. But I mean, this is something that's totally up for debate. The second chapter, of course, is set very much in the height of the Mexploitation era, which lasted from the early to mid 60s into the 1980s. And then, of course, the third chapter looks at kind of what happens following the neoliberalization of the Mexican cinema, or the national film industry in Mexico. And so on the one hand, we kind of have these different moments in the history of the film industry, but on the other hand, and equally important, the relationship between church and state is evolving at the same time, parallel to these shifts in the film industry. And so it's a really interesting, it's an interesting and ambitious study, because we're trying to talk about how the church is represented in these different periods of Mexican cinema. And you do a very nice job of kind of keeping in mind that during the Golden Age, it's this. During the Mexploitation Age, we've got something a little different going on. And then, in the 1990s with the neoliberalization, all of a sudden, there are huge changes in reception, in distribution, in production of cinema. But then there's also a shift in how people are approaching the church. So with the Golden Age, this is immediately after the two Cristiadas, right, that had recently happened. The Golden Age starts in 1940. This is right after the Cristero Wars and kind of the revolutionary period. And so what we have here is we have these films that are basically kind of questioning the role of the church in that context. And so without further ado, I'm going to look at that first chapter. And so, as I mentioned before, I've also written on Maria Candelaria and Rio Escondido in my own book. And so in my book, I had actually argued that the female protagonists of the book function as cyborg virgins who, quote, aim to achieve modernity through technological advances and traditional modernity, or traditional morality, close quote. And so because of that kind of affected the way that I approached your text, because I feel like you enter into a really interesting dialogue there. So where I had focused on these characters' emulations of the Virgin, you instead chose to focus on the representation of the Catholic Church in Mexican society writ large. And in so doing, you identified numerous powerful critiques. For example, you noted, and I had never made this connection before, that the priest of Maria Candelaria is I'm going to put in parentheses, somewhat well-meaning individual who, for some reason, struggles to advocate for indigenous people before the secular leaders who abuse their power. That reading really draws attention to Emilio Fernandez's assertions that the church leadership is ineffectual as an institution because it acquiesces to and participates in the corruption that surrounds it. You include several fantastic observations. Your discussion of Maria Candelaria's decision to, at the request of the priest, bring her pig to the feast at St. Francis de Assisi, the feast of St. Francis de Assisi, proves especially telling in this regard, because while he's ostensibly acting in goodwill, he also causes more problems for Maria Candelaria because she brought an unclean animal to the event and everybody else gets mad at her for that, and they make a direct connection to her lineage as being a daughter of a sex worker, which causes lots of problems for her in the town. And then one of the strongest examples is when you discuss that wedding that happens between Maria Candelaria and Lorenzo Rafael. because right as they're about to get married, of course, Don Damian, the local cacique, comes in and says we need to arrest him, and the priest doesn't really do anything to stop it. Maybe he can't do it. Maybe he just chooses not to. In any event, what we see here is that the church is not the institution that the masses need to turn to if they want to have what's the word? If they want to be liberated, right, from what's going on and the oppression in the area. Even at the end of the film, when the masses stone Maria Candelaria to death, the priest doesn't do anything to stop the violence. He just kind of goes to console Pedro Armendáriz, Lorenzo Rafael at the end of the film. And so what we see then is kind of this idea that the institutional church is not going to be very useful in combating the oppression that the people face, which is interesting because there are so many cases of popular Catholicism that play out in the film. Maria Candelaria is very clearly a type and shadow of the Virgin of Guadalupe. But she seems to be much more of a popular representation, not institutional. So it's a really, really interesting dynamic that we have here. And then, of course, my favorite movie of the two is Rio Escondido. And no, it does not have subtitles. I have looked over and over and over for subtitles for that one because I would love to teach it to my undergraduate students in Latin American studies, but they can't speak Spanish, half of them. And so it doesn't work. But your discussion about that opening segment of the film and kind of the messianic, almost religious aura that we get as she walks through the Palacio Nacional and as she learns about the national history is really important. That and that discussion of the president kind of viewed from behind, speaking with the voice of God, as it were. All of this is very important. I also liked how you discussed the film's representation of the maestra rural as kind of a priest speaking before a congregation. It's not a mistake, right, that Emilio Fernandez does this. So he's very much tapping into this spiritual and religious furor as he's doing this. One of the things that I would have loved to see explored maybe a little bit more, especially just in light of what you said with Maria Candelaria, is that the local priest in this film, once again, is very much under the thumb of the local cacique. Until Maria Candelaria, until Rosaura, played by Maria Felix, both Marias, I always get thrown off by that. Before Rosaura comes in and basically reteaches him how to be a good priest, and then he kind of repents afterward, right? I would have loved to kind of see how that dynamic plays out throughout your analysis. Just kind of this, once again, we have this ineffectual representation of institutional Catholicism, in this case redeemed by a person that is much more of a popular representation of Catholicism. And in a similar vein, another thing that I think would have been interesting to explore maybe a little bit more, especially in the context of what you're arguing, is the really problematic fact that we have two female protagonists who are kind of popular representations of the Virgin Mary, or the Virgin Guadalupe, sorry, who end up as martyrs. They end up having to give their life for the nation in both cases. And what does that mean? That's a question for you. Like, what does that mean? I don't have an answer for that, but it seems like there's something going on there that would be interesting to explore a little bit more in depth. But again, love the chapter. Thought that it was very interesting. I also enjoyed what you did with the other chapters. I really enjoyed that you included some exploitation works, because it wasn't until very recently that you could find anything good about films made from the 1960s and 1970s. And so seeing something this good was refreshing, because I'm gearing up to work on a project on that time period as well, the star system. And so it was fun to kind of see how that worked out. And something really interesting here is that the relationship, right, between the church and the state has changed. There's a different dynamic about sexual morality, for example. In the first film, it's very traditional. In the second one, in the second period, society is a little more open, I would say. And and I mean, you're able to have films about priests going into brothels and interacting with madams and with sex workers, which probably would have been difficult in the 40s and 50s, as kind of my take based on the films that I've watched. And so it was nice to kind of see that dynamic and how that has changed. I thought it was also interesting how the church doesn't really take on a political role here beyond kind of this these micro level attempts to kind of save sex workers from their sinful occupations. And so it seems like there is kind of this idea there about the proper role of the church in society and keeping it out of politics more generally and focusing more on these micro level questions, which I find interesting. And that changes right in your final section where we kind of move into neoliberalism and we get the rise of the PAN. And if there was kind of a cozy relationship between the church and the PRI, with the PAN, it's we have much more proud Catholics, people that are bringing their religion more explicitly into politics than what we'd seen up until that time. And we see that once again kind of reflected in these films. My favorite analysis of the three was your discussion of El Crimen del Padre Amaro, because once again, you kind of have these multiple generations of priests that are all corrupt in their own way. And so you have this quote in there where you say, Father Amaro aligns with the Partido de Acción Nacional's claims of reform without any evidence that their reforms fundamentally changed Mexico. And then a little bit later, you mentioned that the film's portrayals of rape and other types of corruption allude to, quote, problems in the political sphere and other problems that relate to power regardless of political party, close quote. And I think that gets at a lot of what the project of this film is. So similar to the scenes where the church colludes with drug cartels, these elements of the movie speak to the shenanigans among both the political class and the clergy. I had to use the word shenanigans there because it works. Ultimately, these films represent a shift in film production and consumption, but they continue to do so in a way that invokes religion and religious imageries. And I think that's kind of one of the most important takeaways from this, that even as things change, this tension between church and state continues to exist. I think that I am just about out of time. Yeah, I have 58 seconds. So in conclusion, the book does a fantastic job of teasing out the relations among church, state, and society through film, and focusing on the representation of Mexico's largest religious organization on the silver screen. You've tracked the evolution of the national film industry and the national politics. Your readings are compelling, and they've opened the way for future scholars to engage with your work in numerous ways. I wish to applaud you for your excellent study and for your contributions to Mexican Catholic studies, as well as Mexican and Latin American film studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for your comments. And it's great, just from the two comments alone, we have kind of a variety of disciplines commenting on Dr. Janzen's book. So I think this is really great. I want to give Dr. Janzen the time to respond to the comments, and then we'll open up the Q&A.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to read my book and to think so deeply about it. I've made a few notes on your comments. First, I appreciate that you as a historian understand the historical nature of my project and also articulate it in ways that make sense in your discipline. I have taught portions of this book to my own students at the University of South Carolina and also in a 1-credit class to master's students at Brigham Young University, like a week-long crash course that they do. And in both of those cases, the students were very familiar with religious imagery. At BYU, both students had grown up Catholic and then had joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But because of that, they had a really deep understanding, and one of them was from Mexico. So that was really quite something. But it's so cool to see the ways that students can interact with these. But man, it is so hard to get films with subtitles. I have some colleagues in Mexican film studies who are trying to subtitle not Rio Escondido, a film that they could get rights for. And I'm just impressed that they're doing this, but also the amount of work required. So good luck, and maybe someday someone will do this film. The first question that you had, this is for Dr. Jaime Pensado, was about the time periods. So I think that you have noted two areas of Mexican history that are not ones that I find the most interesting. Like my two personal favorite sexenios are 1940 to 1946 and 1946 to 1952. And then between there and like 1970, are like so many important things happen in Mexican history, but like those are the ones where I just think it's fascinating to watch the development of the PRI with Avila Camacho and Alemán. But when I'm thinking about the 1950s, the reason why I liked your question about like, oh, you could do more is because I'm not going to rewrite this book. I don't think it's going to sell the thousands of copies required to make a second edition, but I can write articles, and I keep thinking about these things. I was reading this summer about like rosary campaigns that were started in the US, but like a global thing from extremely conservative branches of Catholicism. I was reading about Brazil and elsewhere in South America, but thinking about like those aspects of a large donor pockets that were funding films that like traveled around. This is not the only case. It was just a book about the rosary, about rosary campaigns. And to think about that kind of thing happening in Mexico as well, and how the Catholic Church was doing so much at that time. Yeah, that would be fascinating to think about.
And if I may, on the question of the 1950s, I think it's worth thinking about this moment as sort of the golden age, but for Catholic action, right? I mean,
Yes.
and that's kind of what I was getting at, and I meant to say that in my comments and question, but I sort of left that out. But I kept wondering, right? I mean, this sort of new spaces that are created by Catholic action that are putting pressure on filmmakers, the industry in general, the state, and so on and so forth. And in so doing, they're kind of shifting the way in which films are created and create new spaces to articulate notions of Catholicism. So anyways, I just kind of didn't want to leave that out. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but I'm hoping that this becomes a dialogue.
Yeah, that's what I am also hoping. And that's how I understood both your comments and David's. When you write a book, especially one that came out in 2021, there are not as many opportunities to talk about it. So it's just so exciting to keep getting to do that. And for the 1980s, I think that would also be such an interesting case to think about. When I was thinking about ways that I could have expanded this project, or in the future, I was thinking more about B movies and ones with nuns. No examples come to mind, but thinking about, in my interpretation of Catholicism, nuns are extremely important, like in the lives of everyday people. And then in these movies that keep featuring priests, they're like, oh, they're like, whatever, who cares? But they're the ones who are actually doing everything. But films that would focus on them, I think, would offer such an interesting examination of the role of women religious, but also the role of women generally. Particularly like after Vatican II with habits, that becomes very interesting in a cinematic sense, and like how that's used and how people understand ideas of dress and ideas of being conservative or liberal, which don't always go together in the way that people who don't think deeply about these things would expect. So I just think that'd be such an exciting avenue for further research, as well as with the censorship questions, because religious symbols are so powerful in a country that is so Catholic. And then there's powerful Catholic interests and popular expressions of religiosity, and how all of these interact in a moment when there are renewed attempts to control what is distributed or what is made. Yeah, that's such a fascinating thing to think about for the future. And always, this relationship between the church and the state is one in Mexico that I think could be written about more. Like, as you were saying, it is only in kind of more recent decades that historians who are not specifically like a historian of Catholicism and hired in that kind of job, or published exclusively on that, have really started considering the role of the Catholic Church seriously. Like, the hold that a certain kind of atheism has on the academy is extremely powerful. Which is strange considering the first academics were, I believe, monks. At least like the ones that we can trace our lineage to here in the United States. The earliest universities were, of course, not Christian. But like, just thinking about, there's so many things that I would like to know that I don't think are in an archival document. It's not like, so I talked to this, like in the, publicly available papers of some president, like, there was this meeting and this is exactly what they talked about. Like, we're never going to know that. But I think that with the increase in scholarship and the papers from like Catholic Action and things like that, are pretty illustrative of tendencies in Mexican history. So yeah, so many exciting things to think about. And David, your comments, the one that I am thinking especially about is like, what happens when this popular representation of the Virgen de Guadalupe becomes a martyr? And thinking about that in the context of the significance of imagery of the Virgen de Guadalupe, like in movements for independence and cristeros and so many other things in Mexico. Like, what does that mean? Does it mean that this movement has died? Is it a comment on that? Is it a comment on secularism is killing the Virgen de Guadalupe? Or is it suggesting that the Virgen is a martyr-like figure, like because she's a quintessential mother, and that is one of the qualities of the ideal mother? There's so much there.
Yeah, I keep coming back to feminicide with both of those characters as well. Like,
Oh,
which is so I just think there's so much to. I don't have an answer, but that keeps jumping out to me just with how this happens. But then all the other things that you're saying, I think, are also true, and so I think there's something that needs to be teased out, and I think you'd be great at doing that. So
thank you. Yeah, that's something that I think is constantly worth thinking about. Yeah, imagery of the Virgin Mary there's so much. And it's so interesting because especially the Virgen de Guadalupe, like so many different meetings for a particular time and place. And if you think about it in relationship to so much of cultural production, like literary and otherwise, that is happening right now about feminicide, that is not a lineage that had occurred to me, but there are, like, throughout the 20th century, there are kind of like gestures towards that, because women dying because men kill them is something that happens. And it's also interesting that you mentioned that Rosaura is the one who like teaches a priest how to be a priest. I think this could go with the representation of nuns. Like, nuns are teaching the priests how to properly be priests. Like, I think that there could be something there in films that I have not watched. But like, the man has to be the leader, but the woman is the like neck who turns the head kind of idea of gender. But I don't know. Like, there's so many connections in the characters of Rosaura and the cacique and the priest, like what it could all mean. Yeah.
And then since it's so close to the revolution, there's also that idea of the soldaderas. And of course, she plays a soldadera in another film that comes out like actually a movie that came out, I think, a year earlier, Enamorada. She becomes a soldadera at the end of the film to Pedro Armendáriz, which is another reason why the Maria and Pedro Armendáriz and all, I get it all. Anyway, then yeah. There's
And I think the visual representation in this film does evoke, like, some of her costuming could evoke a soldadera. A lot of it evokes like what rural Mexican women wear, or what cineastas wanted people to think that they were wearing. But I think that there is something. I also think that we're supposed to go to Q&A. I'm just gonna grab my water bottle and I'll be right back before the Q&A.
No problem. Take your time. And thank you to Rebecca for answering the questions from both Jaime and David. And thank you as well for engaging this kind of conversation. Those are always better than this more formal structure than anything else. So I want to give the opportunity for the folks in the audience, if you happen to have a question, if you could raise your hand. Si tienes una pregunta, puedes levantar la mano, and we'll just kind of go hand by hand in that order for the remaining about what we have about now is 18 minutes left of our book talk today. So yeah, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Si tienes una pregunta, puedes levantar la mano. Y vamos a empezar con Ricardo. Ricardo, adelante.
Thanks, Nate. I'm gonna abuse our power a little bit here and ask the first question. You can hear me, right? I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me. So I'm curious. So first of all, this is fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca, for such a wonderful presentation, and also Jaime and David for your comments. I'm someone who works on the. We were just having this conversation before the chat, opened up. I'm someone who works on the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s, and the beginnings of these conversations around film. I've seen this in the archive. It's not the topic of my book, but it's something that I've seen in the primary sources and archival collections. And I'm really curious about this transition where film, in the 1920s and 30s is regarded as something that's very foreign, associated with foreignness, and something that is non-Mexican. In the sources that I've seen, it's seen as either a product of kind of American Yankee commercialism in Hollywood, or on the other side, what people call, the French Freemasonry, right? And this, this conspiratorial thinking, right? That, is not just film, it's also fashion, it's also all these other things. And I'm curious as to the moment or the turning point where like film becomes Mexican, right? Like the Mexican film industry actually becomes something that is no longer seen as foreign, but it's actually like now we're talking about, debates about Mexican identity and, different ways to be Mexican, right? What that means, right? For Catholics and also non-Catholics, and, films on either side of this debate, and I know that Hyman touches on some of this in his recent book as well. And I'm just curious, Rebecca, when you writing this book and as you were thinking about the chronology and the sexenios, right? In the way that you were writing the book, were these also debates about Mexicanidad and national identity, right? And were there these fears of foreign incursion, that you might have seen, maybe earlier in the 20th century? Or were these really just debates about something else entirely? Because I'm just personally curious. Again, I'm not writing on this specifically, but I'm really curious to, hearing this conversation, like when did the film industry actually become Mexican and not something that was like a foreign other that was bringing in all this radicalism to, Mexican Catholic society? Like I'm really, really curious about, if there's, it doesn't even have to be a specific year, but, just kind of this transition, right? Where these conversations then become debates about national identity and no longer conversations about, invasion or any sort of conspiracy, right? Against what is considered Mexican.
I would put that in or around 1933, with the development of the industry that supported the Golden Age films. I think in terms of consolidation of the Mexican state, you could date that to 1934 with like Lázaro Cárdenas. I think it starts in 1940. I think 1934 to 1940 is a period of great change. And then like the PRI develops its relationships with super unions like the Confederación Nacional Campesina de Trabajadores. And I think that it's in that period, like of Cardenismo, that you can see a lot of these things being made Mexican, even though, in my opinion, it's not fully consolidated. Although some people obviously think that I'm wrong. But I think too, that's a period when like Mexico is advertising or thinking about itself in terms of various kinds of tourism, just like marketing other markers of Mexico in a more public way, like that could be seen by people who are not necessarily in Mexico, kind of arise around the same time. But yeah, that's those films also that carry on throughout the 1940s are the ones that are very clearly saying something about Mexico and the Mexican nation and like who they're becoming, in a way that films earlier, because of the ongoing conflicts and instability, were not able to. And also I think the development of film technology in general, like it just, these things happen about film and they happen in Mexico that kind of mean mid 1930s is when I would say, but I think you could pin it at a lot of different times. I also have to say, man, historians, you really care about dates.
Well, I wasn't looking for a date per se. I just like I understand the questions coming from the book, right? And I understand as we get into the Cold War and the 1950s and 60s, right? There are all these questions about, like the narrative of Mexican culture and the crisis of the revolutionary narrative that Jaime is talking about. For me, it's really fascinating because, especially with film, like I'm looking at the archive and no one is referring to the film industry as like as being a Mexican thing, like a Mexican, like of course I know what you mean. Like the Mexican film industry itself has not actually taken off yet in the ways that it does after the 1930s. Like I understand that, and that's part of the answer I think I was trying to get at. But also, there is this element of foreignness that gets, particularly from the Catholic perspective, right? Like film is branded as just foreign and non-Catholic and unpatriotic and either American or European or this or that, but not anything that could be compatible, right? And Jaime brings this up in his book with the figure of Emma Siegler and the JCFM, which I write about the JCFM too in an earlier period. How she wants to have like a Catholic Mexican film project, right? And we're talking there about the late 40s, early 50s, right? And so by this point, I mean, that's right? Like there's been a sense of like Mexicans embracing both Catholic and non, like the film industry. But I'm trying to figure out, well, maybe that's another article, maybe that's a conference or a panel or something. But like, how does the shift happen? Is it, tied with the Mexican film industry, with Cardenismo, with the consolidation of the state, right? From the Catholic perspective, is it Catholic action, its rise in 1930, and also subsequent consolidation in the 40s with Avila Camacho and so on? I'm trying to just like, yes, you're right. I guess in a sense, I am obsessed with the periodization, but I'm just trying to think historically here. Like, how do I get what I see in the archive and make it make sense with what we're seeing and what you all are demonstrating, right? So, yeah.
Could I say something about this? Because I was thinking along those lines, right? I think you phrased the question much better. But I think again, the question of the nation, right? Who gets to decide what the nation is, right? And of course, it is the revolutionary state that's basically dictating what the nation should be. And a lot of these films kind of speak to that. But I think there's like private enterprises that also begin to kind of articulate competing notions of the nation, right? And I'm thinking of, I don't know, rather than a indigenista or mestizo identity, I'm thinking of the role that Hispanistas play, right, in articulating a different understanding of what the nation is. And I'm thinking specifically of someone like Jorge Negrete, like the actor, right, who represents a wider Mexico, kind of an identity that is not rooted in indigenismo, but rather it's rooted in this kind of nostalgia of the colonial past, right? And I think there's these competing narratives of the nation. And I think Catholicism gets meddled in these discussions. And I think it's quite interesting to see these different representations of national identities that really also kind of question the ways in which the Catholic Church is then shifting in the post-revolutionary period, which I think is fascinating.
Anyway, thank you for answering. I forget, it's good to have interdisciplinary conversations. This is great. So thank you so much, and again, congrats on the book and wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And I completely agree. I think these kinds of conversations are so important, right? So often we kind of speak within a bubble, within our own fields, and so nice to have these conversations between different disciplines and different fields. This is great. We have about 8 minutes left, so let's see if anyone else has any questions in the audience. A ver si alguien más tiene una pregunta. Y las preguntas pueden ser en español si quieren. Doesn't seem to be. Oh, Marta.
¿Dónde podemos conseguir el libro?
Rebecca.
Se puede comprar, creo que está en Amazon,
Ok.
o por si es difícil conseguir el libro, tengo copias en PDF que podría compartir. Se pueden poner en contacto conmigo. Voy a poner mi correo del trabajo en el chat y ahí cualquier persona que quiera comunicarse conmigo por lo del
Te lo
libro.
Te lo agradezco mucho y felicidades por el texto, aunque no lo conozco. Pero la discusión ha resultado muy interesante.
Pues gracias por venir y eso es, como estaban diciendo los colegas, y estábamos platicando antes de que empezara el Zoom, para mí es una gran oportunidad de compartir con colegas historiadores y también colegas que trabajan en la academia aquí en Estados Unidos y también en otros lados o en otras disciplinas que no sean ni historia ni literatura. O sea, siempre es interesante poder conocer otras personas como usted en una charla así.
Gracias.
Gracias otra vez, Marta.
Perdón, es que me quedé pensando en todo este tema de la mexicanidad, que es tan complejo, ¿no? Como decían tanto Jaime como Ricardo, que, bueno, yo recuerdo, no por mi edad, sino porque lo vi en el archivo, que en los 60, por ejemplo, la intervención de la iglesia como censora de el cine, ¿no? Es fundamental. Muchos no le hacían caso, pero un colega contaba que él iba a ver películas para adultos a los 12, 13 años y que estaban estos señores sacándolos a los niños, ¿no? Que le decían, tú no, porque estás muy chiquito y los sacaban del cine, ¿no? Entonces, todo este tema de la Liga de la Decencia que ustedes conocen muy bien es interesantísimo. Y por otro lado, no encuentro, vaya, no sé, no soy experta en el tema, pero como creadores católicos, fuera de una que otra película como, no recuerdo el nombre exacto, pero eso sí, como El Milagro del Tepeyac o una cosa así, ¿no? Así como proselitista, pero fuera de eso, no, ignoro. Pero sería muy interesante como ver dónde estaban los católicos, si producían o no, o si responden a un catolicismo de soy católico de misa de domingo, pero lo que vende es otra cosa, ¿no? Lo que vende es cine de ficheras en los 70, en los 80, lo que vende es el crimen del padre Amaro, pero yo soy muy católico, no sé. Yo creo que es bien interesante repensarlo. Muchas gracias a todos por tan interesante diálogo.
Yo creo que en esa dirección iban un poco las preguntas de Jaime. Y sí, hasta donde yo sepa, no se ha escrito, a lo mejor me toca a mí, o también aprovechar de lo que ha trabajado Jaime y otros colegas también, para pensar eso. O sea, ¿qué hacían la gente que andaba a misa cada domingo o inclusive, o sea, que tiene su mamá, su tía que va a diario, ¿no? ¿Qué, qué hacen? Porque hay cantidades impresionantes de dinero siempre asociados con la iglesia, ¿no? Y cómo se usaban en México y de dónde venía ese dinero. O sea, si era de mexicanos o de la iglesia arraigada en México o del Vaticano o de Estados Unidos y de quiénes, o sea, de qué tipo de católico. Eso sí me interesa mucho saber, porque el cine, creo que Jaime quiere decir algo, como estaba comentando él, es pedagógico, o sea, entonces vale la pena pensar.
Sí. Sí, y hay compañías de producción católicas. Muchas de ellas están por ejemplo, en Guadalajara, pero en la región de Jalisco,
Ah,
que se
tienen.
fundan por católicos y empiezan a poner presión en estas otras productoras del cine mexicano que no son católicas, ¿no? Pero también hay directores que se identifican como tal, se identifican como católicos y aprovechan de la industria para regañar a la gente. Hay directores como el mismo Alejandro Galindo, que es muy, muy famoso y que produjo muchísimas películas, dirigió muchísimas películas, pero él se convierte en un católico bastante conservador y sus películas regañan a la gente, hablan mucho de lo que no se debe de hacer. Y también por lo mismo, bueno, hace muchas referencias a símbolos católicos, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Pero creo que falta mucho como para entender esos espacios que se generan dentro de la misma industria como para ver bien cómo los católicos se aprovechan y también a través de boicots, a través de una serie de cosas, de instrumentos que utilizan, abren espacios en la industria del cine.
Y claro, y también cuántas películas no son moralinas, ¿no? No tienen una buena dosis de moralina católica a lo largo de mucho, incluso ¿cómo se llama? Las chicas del padre Méndez, ¿no? O sea, hay que rescatarlas. Hubo una, seguramente ustedes lo conocen muy bien, una orden de monjas que se llamaba las Hijas del Buen Pastor,
Mm.
que se dedicaban a rescatar a las prostitutas del pecado. Entonces iban por ellas y se las llevaban al convento. Entonces el convento era una pachanga padrísima, ¿no? Pero sí tenían como eso de el sexo es tan malo, ¿no? La sexualidad es tan mala, hay que rescatar a estas mujeres. Y se las llevaban y de verdad tenían broncas, o sea, para mantenerlas adentro. Las secuestraban, literal, ¿no? Entonces es un poco como eso lo que quiere hacer el padre Méndez, ¿no? En ese sentido.
Pues gracias otra vez por tu pregunta. Rebecca, ¿quieres decir algo?
No, no más. Quisiera agradecer por los comentarios porque me ayudan a pensar más. Sí, muchas gracias.
Well, with that, we are at the hour, so I really want to thank you all for participating today. In particular, I want to thank Dr. Rebecca Janzen for presenting her book. Really enjoyed the conversation today, so thank you so much for that. And thank you as well to Dr. Jaime Pensado and Dr. David Dalton on your comments. And thank you to the audience for providing very interesting questions. And we had a really great conversation and dialogue too. So, like Ricardo said earlier, we have a series of events that we are going to be sharing. So go ahead to follow us on social media. We're on Historians of Catholic Mexico on Facebook and HisCatMex on Twitter. We're going to begin our seminar series. It was on hiatus last year, but we're bringing it back. And so next month, if you want to mark this on your calendars, the first presentation will be on October 29th at 5 p.m. Hora de la Ciudad de Mexico. And it will be with Dr. Pedro Espinosa Melendez. So if you want to come then, el 29 de octubre, con el doctor Pedro Espinosa Meléndez, y vamos a empezar con la serie de seminarios otra vez. So thank you so much, everyone, once more, and congratulations again, Rebecca, on your book. So thanks so much, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Take care.